Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LPL Week 1 Summer Splits, not Summer Group Stage overview and analysis video. I don't know what this stage is technically called. It's the second stage. We are finally out of the placements. We know which teams are going to be in the upper and the lower group. We know the names of those groups now. Of course, Group Ascend and Group Nirvana. Very interesting name choices. Obviously, it's a bit of a theme that they've been going with over the course of this year, but certainly, a shocking decision in terms of the branding there. We will be calling them that for the rest of the split, but now we know which teams are going to be in which sections, which teams are going to be playing for a chance to qualify for the upper playoff seeds, and which teams are going to be playing to potentially, hopefully, get a play-in spot. I'm excited to go over everything that happened here in Week 1. It was a very shortened Week 1 because of the Esports World Cup, and so there really weren't a lot of games. There wasn't a lot of action. It didn't start until, basically the end of the week. Only 6 series to cover in today's video, so it's going to be a bit of a shorter one, especially for you LPL fans, right before we pick up the LPL and we get back to those, 19 best-of-3 weeks that we had gotten used to from last year. But if you are excited, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LPL to get to this point, that's the entire placement stage. That's what I predicted to happen at the beginning of the split. You can check out the playlist up in the iCard that's going to have all that information there. But today we are just going to be going over the 6 series that comprise of week number 1, technically, here in the actual summer split. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover. And at the end of the video, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 17, talking about which teams I think are doing better or worse than maybe I was anticipating going into the week. Spoiler alert, not really a ton of shocks here. At least for me, I've been, a little bit more hesitant to make any drastic changes to my power rankings, if only because when you have these limited group stage matchups, when you have a lot of these teams that are only playing a couple of other styles, it's really hard to get a really clear idea of where they land. So I was really excited to see how they would adapt here in week number 1. But without further ado, I've wasted enough of your time at the beginning of this. Up on the screen now, you can see those groups just quickly to kind of overview them. Of course, the way that we got here was those placement groups where we had 4 groups of 4 teams, and one of them had 5 teams because the LPL is 17 teams, the most awkward number you could possibly have for the LPL. But we have 9 teams in that upper group, and then we have the rest down in that lower group, so 9 in group Ascend and the rest in group Nirvana. That is, of course, like we said, going to dictate how these teams end up trying to qualify for the actual playoffs itself. Group Ascend, of course, trying to get into the playoffs proper instead of the play-in stage. The bottom 2 teams from Group Ascend, that upper group, will have to go into the play-in stage for the playoffs, which is obviously not ideal for them. But the Group Nirvana, the bottom group, they are playing for their lives here. You need to be one of the top 4 teams in Group Nirvana to even have an opportunity to play your way into the play-in stage. And so definitely more important to win if you're in that lower group. Getting into the upper group is definitely a bit of a safety net, but they earned it from finishing either first, second, or in one case, third in their group in the previous stage. So it's likely the best teams in the upper group, the worst teams in the lower group, and that's why it ends up working out this way. But it also makes Group Nirvana games a lot more important, at least in my opinion. Group Ascend games are definitely interesting to see where these teams are and to see where they're landing, but it's not necessarily as important in terms of the overall output. So that's a little bit of an overview, I guess, for those of you who aren't familiar with the format. Trust me, it's very confusing. This is one of the most confusing, regular season formats we've gotten in any major region ever. And so I understand why there are a lot of people that just don't really understand what's happening. And I also don't understand why games are being played. I thought, regional games were on hold because of the Esports World Cup, yet here we are. So, it is what it is. I guess they had to get all those games in on time, and this was just the only way to do that. But let's go ahead and talk about the actual week, shall we? We only have 6 best of 3s to cover in this video, much shorter than the typical LPL video. So without further ado, let's start off with day number 1. And day number 1, this entire stage actually kicks off with a pretty big rivalry here in the LPL that has not lived up to the billing over the course of 2024. It's Edward Gaming taking on RNG, and EDG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This was certainly a series. It was not particularly good from either of these 2 teams. All 3 of these games were super sloppy, super bad, and honestly just Not particularly fun to watch. I'm not really enthused about either of these two teams, especially EDG, who walked out of this with a win. I think people expected them to come into this lower group, the group Nirvana, and just kind of dominate it, be one of the better teams in the group. RNG has not been good over the course of this year, and yes, they made some roster changes that could potentially raise their floor because they just had so many things going wrong for them, and I think just getting new faces in the building is a good thing, but it's not like RNG played well. They played horrible in this series. EDG just also played horrible. They were just lucky to be able to walk out of it with a win. Player of the series is pretty obviously, to me, going to go to Wink. He continues to be by far the best player on EDG over the course of this split. It's really funny how impactful that move was, because I know a lot of people really kind of changed their tune on EDG in the preseason or like the mid-season here because of the acquisitions of Cryan and Wink. Cryan's been very up and down, mostly down, quite frankly, for EDG in the mid lane. He's not been a particularly strong laner for this team, but Wink has been everything he should have been, and then some. He has been everything that he was hyped up to be for this team, and then some. He's been by far their best player, and he continues to be the one that's creating all of the aggressive plays for them. His positioning was phenomenal. His team fighting was phenomenal. And let me tell you, team fighting was of a paramount importance in this series, because none of these games were ever going to finish before 30 minutes because neither team really took any risks. So credit to Wink. I thought he was really excellent. I think you could, give some shout outs to players like Jeje in the jungle, who was really good specifically on the Zyra in game number 1. I think he was definitely less impactful on the Karthus, even though these games were going significantly longer, but the Zyra was generally fine. And then solo kill on the top side, I really like solo kill. I'm like really buying into the solo kill hype. We'll talk about Juice on the other side. Juice has actually shown some very interesting things for RNG as well. We will definitely talk about that Kasante game in game number 2, but solo kill has been really good for EDG. He has definitely been one of the more intriguing rookies, and specifically for an EDG team that has just not been able to find anybody to step up and be consistent, especially their young players. Solo kill has won a lot more than he has lost, especially in 1v1s, and I think that that's a really impressive thing to be able to say. So solo kill looking good, Wink looking good, Jeje, in the right circumstance can look good. I still think he's a bit overhyped, but he can still look good. Cryan scoreline definitely a bit better than his individual performances. Leave continues to make back-breaking errors down the stretch of games. It just is what it is. Like, you have to coach that out of him, but EDG needs to figure something out, because again, this is not a team that wants to be coasting by against RNG. They are a team that wants to be the best team in Group Nirvana, and right now, this was not a performance that gave me a lot of confidence that they can do that. And then for RNG on the other side, again, a couple of substitutions. Geju is coming in for Wei. There are rumors that Wei is out and going somewhere else. We'll touch on those if they end up being real, but Wei, at the very least, is not starting here for RNG. And then, of course, Ming is out, Iwandi is in, and so that was a change that I just think needed to be made as a different support. It was clearly not working between Huanfeng and Ming has just been horrible in 2024. Truly one of the worst supports in the LPL, which right now is actually kind of a big bar. Like, the supports have not been great at the LPL level, so it's important, I think, to get new faces in to give them some new life. Didn't really work out here. This team didn't look particularly strong in this series. I continue to think that Huanfeng is mega stuck. He just doesn't really make mistakes, and he is super mechanically talented. Maybe he's not the most aggressive AD carry in the world, but he kind of was in his prime, which gives me some confidence that if he were on a better team that had more options, he could get that back. I just think he's scared of being the only one on the team that actually survives in a lot of these circumstances, and so he ends up playing a lot more passive than maybe some of the other AD carries around his skill level just due to circumstance. But again, I really value Huanfeng. I think he's a very solid player, and Juice honestly continues to look good in the top side as well. That Kasante game in game 2 was really good, and honestly, he was good on the Twisted Fate in game number 1 as well. I think he's an interesting player. It was the right move to move forward with him instead of ZDZ. We'll see where that goes, but the new additions weren't exactly ideal here. They were honestly the two that I was determining who to give dud of the series to. I'm going to give it to Geju in the jungle. It just felt like he was never really on the same page as the rest of the team. He is a young player who is being inserted into this lineup to kind of save their season. I'm not going to try and expect him to just figure things out immediately, but he was not particularly good in this first series. Like I said, very off-kilter with the rest of the team. It didn't feel like he was very synergistic, and his team fighting was very lackluster, in my opinion, on both the Brand and the Lilia. And then Iwandi in the support position just wasn't particularly good in terms of engages. Wink was way more active on the other side of this matchup. But again, new player, new team, get him acclimated. These are the macro roles, jungle and support. These are the roles that you need communication with the rest of your team more than basically anything else. And so to see those two struggle and get first, it's not the most shocking thing in in the world, but if Juice and Hwanfeng can continue to play well, I mean, if Awandi and Geju can get up to speed, I'm never really going to expect that of Tong Yuan because he's just not a player that I really believe in. But, you know, if the other 4 members of this team can get up to speed, maybe they could do something because, you know, this was an okay series at the very least in terms of result, but they didn't look good. And, you know, I'm not really expecting RNG to just miraculously turn a corner. And for EDG, they need to get better than this if they want to be a top 1 or 2 team in Group Nirvana. Like, it's not a guarantee. There are good teams down here, like teams that are going to be around top 8 or top 9 in the LPL, teams that could legitimately make playoffs. And if EDG wants to even remotely be in that conversation, they simply have to clean up whatever this gameplay was. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's going to be our first series of the Group Ascend. It's Anyone's Legend taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and AL is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. This is not an upset. I saw some people being a bit surprised by this outcome, but AL is one of the best teams in the LPL right now. I think we all kind of saw that in their group stage. They had a really tough group, all things considered. You know, Ninjas and Pyjamas at the very least is a good team. Ultra Prime ended up being way better than anticipated, and even with Weibo Gaming underperforming, they are a scary team to have to go into because they can upset anybody, as basically everyone has figured out over the past couple of years with that organization. And yet AL came out very clearly on top. They were absolutely the best group in Group D, or the best team in Group D, and so to see them come out and beat FunPlus Phoenix, who I have not really been all that in on over the course of this year, it's not entirely surprising. And again, it's their solo laners that are stepping up and doing really well for the team. Player of the series is going to go to Ale in the top lane. He has been a breath of fresh air for this team. They've really struggled to find any sort of pressure on the top side of the map, and Ale has obviously given them that. I think he is the missing piece. He was the missing piece for this roster. They just weren't getting this with Harry in the spring split. They really struggled at being able to generate real tempo on the top side of the map. Like, Shanks was doing his best to create real tempo in terms of the middle of the map, and it just wasn't real. Like, it couldn't do it. Like, it's really hard to be able to control the upper side of the map when your top laner is losing in lane super regularly. So just having someone like Ale that's going to be able to survive in top lane matchups against players like Zhao Lao, who are like middle of the pack in terms of top laners, that's a really good thing overall for AL. And that's not even adding on to the fact that this guy can absolutely destroy games. Look at this Camille game in game number 2. I mean, he literally obliterated FPX basically single-handedly. Like, I want to give a lot of credit to Shanks because Shanks dominated game number 1, and they were definitely the 2 players that stood out the most, but Ale definitely a lot more noticeable in that second game because Camille games are just crazy fun to watch. These were some weird drafts, I would say, from both of these teams. We will talk about FPX's game 2 draft because I think it's horrible, and I just don't really understand why you're going to this now that we are away from Fearless draft. Like, this feels like a Fearless draft kind of game in game number 2, and yet, you know, we're in standard draft now, and this is the time that FPX pulls it out, so definitely a bit strange, but Ale, Shanks definitely taking advantage of that. They were excellent. I continue to think that Kale is underrated as a support. I think he's really starting to get his reputation back up to where it was a couple of years ago, back in 2022, when he was on Sandbox. I think it's pretty, you know, recovered at this point. I think people have realized just how good Kale was and how much of an outlier the back half, especially of 2023, was for him. That team, in general, just had a lot of problems, and I think him getting back to something that's a bit more comfortable in terms of skill level around him is a really good thing. Getting back to playing with Krako, who I think he has great synergy with, is a really good thing, and Kale was excellent here. Hope continues to be very consistent down in the bot lane. That's all you really need from him. Krako was solid. He's adapted to the AP junglers, I think, well. I think overall AL is just a scary team, and right now, as you can see from the power rankings, they're a team that I project to go to Worlds. And then for FunPlus Phoenix on the other side, you know, this team is fine. They are generally an okay team. I don't think they're going to do particularly well in Group Ascend, though. As I've been saying throughout a majority of the year, I think they just lack that upper echelon in terms of talent. Like, Milky Way is that guy, and he can win series on his own, but as we always say with Milky Way, when he plays people that he is better than, he dominates. When he plays people that are about as good as him, which is a lot of the Group Ascend teams, a lot of the best teams in the league, he can struggle a bit more to be able to generate those resources in the same way that he would against, you know, players that he can just easily out-tempo in the early and mid-game. And so it's definitely going to be a big test for Milky Way to be the primary carry for this team. He was far from the only player who wasn't perfect. In fact, he was probably the best player on this team in this series. Everybody else was definitely a little disappointing, but what are we doing in the bot lane? Ashe Pyke in game number 2 is just way too risky against a team that is just straight up better than you in a lot of different aspects. Life was not able to survive on the Pyke. He's going to get out of the series. If you wanted to give it to Dectum, hell, if you wanted to give it to Zhao Laohu in the top lane, you know, I honestly kind of understand. I think both of those players also underperformed, but life was horrible on the Pyke. Like, this Pyke game did not work out. I understand the idea of wanting to trade kills and try to get that Pyke rolling and make it a little bit more difficult for some of these more stationary carries to try and do things, but who are you assassinating in the late game? Are you hoping that it's MF on the ultimate? Well, you're going to have to avoid the combo here, because if Camille or Zyra or Rel or if one of those champions ends up immobilizing you or any of your carries, the fight is already over. The Corki can't really survive that. The Lilia can't really survive that if they're hit by anything. And so it's really a risky comp, and it's a risky decision here to pick Pyke, and it really did not end up working out for life. But Dectum didn't really help. The Ashe also not entirely ideal in game number 2 here. I think if you do want to go for something like the Pyke, something like Jhin maybe would have been a bit more consistent in terms of what you're looking for. I think the Ashe is generally fine in terms of how this, you know, comp ends up being constructed, but I don't think it's ideal. I certainly think that you could have done something better, and he wasn't great on the Ezreal in game 1 either. Zhao Laohu definitely outplayed by Ale, Care definitely outplayed by Shanks. Again, Milky Way was trying to do things, was trying to generate tempo, definitely the best player on the team, and definitely performed like it in this series, but he doesn't get those gigantic advantages in the same way that he does against bad teams, against, you know, Kroko and against Shanks and Ale. Like, they're not going to give him those free resources that he's used to kind of generating in a lot of these matchups where he's up, you know, 2k gold at 15 minutes. So FPX is a good team. I don't think they're an awful team. I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that they're guaranteed not top 10, but I would project them to not do particularly well in this group of 10 just due to a lack of overall talent on the roster. And then for AL on the other side, this is a talented roster. This is one of the best teams in the LPL, and I think they are going to continue to prove that. This was a great introduction, but again, group stage can sometimes lie, so maybe this was just kind of a first test in terms of a really tough group of 10 for them. And then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with a relatively interesting matchup that I think will tell us quite a bit. It's Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Rare Adam. And Rare Adam is going to pick up the 2-0 win. This is not entirely surprising. I had Rare Adam higher in my power rankings. I think they match up relatively well against Thunder Talk so long as Vikla is able to survive. And Vikla was honestly great in this series, and Rare Adam was great everywhere else. That was really the only concern that I had going into this series, was whether or not mid lane was going to be winnable for RA. And as long as he was able to stay even in this series, then I think it would have been fine. He did more than that. He was more than even in this series for RA. The top side of the map was phenomenal. Player of the series is very easily going to go to Xiaoshu for me in the top lane. This is his best series of 2024. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. He dominated in both of these games. Now, there is a massive caveat, and that's Hoya on the other side of this matchup, who is just horrible. Like, he is unplayable in the top lane right now. Thunder Talk fans are, in my opinion, very misguided right now. I think they're placing blame in a lot of wrong areas. I think they have a very bad read of who on their team is good and who on their team is bad. Maybe I'm just talking about the general LoL fandom, but the conversation surrounding Thunder Talk, as per usual, in my opinion, has really been directed in the wrong direction. So we'll talk about that in a second, but Hoya is miserable. I mean, truly unplayable. He reminds me so much of what Decade was in the previous split, where it's just like every single game you get counterpick, you get the Poppy into Jax matchup, and you get absolutely slaughtered in it. It's horrible. It's worst case scenario in every single facet. Xiaoshu was just better, and he did a great job transitioning his early lead into mid-game pressure as well. That's something that we've always kind of wanted to see in terms of development from Xiaoshu. He's always been pretty good at getting early leads. He's just kind of been poor and inconsistent at being able to translate those into actual things across the map. So nice for Xiaoshu to have a good series. Zhao Hao was also very good in this one. He's been phenomenal across this split so far. Once again, I mean, the King of Summer continues to live up to that reputation. It's very funny. Again, I will always make fun of it on this channel that Weibo Gaming brings in Zhao Hao and then drops him right before Summer, where he has performed better every single split of his entire career. Like, you're bringing him in for Summer Zhao Hao, and then you get rid of him right before Summer. I'm not going to blame them too much because Tarzan's been probably their best player, and so it's definitely a bit difficult to talk about, like, oh, you know, it's definitely not worth it to replace him with Tarzan. Like, I understand the idea. It's just a very funny circumstance, and Zhao Hao continuing to prove that he gets better as the year goes along. Vikla was very, very good in this series. Yukao has been dominant on the other side of this. I think at times he's been a top 5 mid laner in the LPL as a whole, just kind of hard stuck on this Thunder Talk team, but Vikla, for the most part, was better and more useful. Even if Yukao didn't play particularly bad, I just want to give props to Vikla, who's actually had a really good split, and nobody's really talking about that because people already made up their minds about him. That's just how LPL fandom works. As soon as you get a reputation as a player, it doesn't really matter what you do. That reputation will carry you, and it's funny, this mid lane matchup's a really good example of that. People will love Yukao regardless of of how he plays, and people will hate Vikla regardless of how he plays, but Vikla was better than UCal in this series, and then Assume and Jway were also pretty solid. Jway is still somebody that I want to see a bit more consistency in terms of timings on these roams and on wards and things like that. It just feels like he needs to figure out, you know, the little stuff a little bit more. That was a problem I had with him on Ultra Prime, but he's still a very interesting support. His mechanics are really good, and Assume is fine. Like, I'm not in love with Assume. I think he's gotten better over the course of this year, which is a good sign, but again, I'm not in on this, you know, oh, Assume needs to be on a top team. Like, no, he absolutely does not. He is probably a top 10 to 12 AD carry in the LPL. I think that's a relatively fair way to put it. So RA is good, but I think most of it is from the top side of the map. Xiao Hao is by far the best player on this team, and if Xiaoshu, who I think really is interesting as a prospect, can continue to develop like this, that's big. But for Thunder Talk on the other side, they are a team with such clear strengths and such clear weaknesses, and that makes them so interesting to talk about here in Group Nirvana, because UCal is so good, and he has been so good for the past couple of years, and, you know, I'm certainly not going to push any sort of UCal slander. I know I talked about how UCal is basically unflappable by the community, but I kind of understand why. Like, he really has been that good. It does kind of remind me of Teddy a bit over in the LCK, where it's like it doesn't really matter how he's playing. The audience is going to glaze him either way, but at least in UCal's case, I think it is mostly deserved. It's the rest of this team that I think a lot of fans have a really weird perception of that I just don't agree with. Beishuan's probably been this team's second best player over the course of this split, and I get it. He was horrible in spring. Like, he was genuinely one of the single worst players in the LPL in this spring split. I'm not going to try to deny that. I'm not going to sit here and say that, you know, spring was, you know, fine for him, but I think people turned on him so hard in spring that they can't realize that he got better in summer, that he has really, like, adapted and been a carry for this team for a lot of the summer split. He's actually done really well in this AP jungle meta. I think very similar to Vikla on the other side of this, where a bad first impression has just led to people assuming that they have not gotten better because they're not actually looking and seeing whether or not these players have improved. Beishuan has gotten significantly better in summer, and like I said, I think he's pretty clearly been this team's best player. I also see, you know, and this is pretty typical of LPL fans, a lot of 1xN glazing. You know, we talk about this a lot on the channel, but LPL fans, there is nothing that gets them, you know, revved up more than an AD carry in their league. Like, in any way, shape, or form, they will find any reason to talk about a young AD carry on a bad team as the next superstar. Soom has gotten it on the other side of this matchup. 1xN is getting that right now. He's fine. Like, he's generally okay. He's like a middle tier AD carry. I think he's relatively similar to Assume, but again, I don't think this is a guy that I'm looking at and saying like, oh, he's hard stuck on Thunder Talk. This is probably around the part of the standings that he should be at in terms of where he is at. The spot lane loses super consistently, and I get support's been a disaster. Feather was bad once again in this series, but you know, 1xN's really not been making it better. He's been playing with good supports before this split, and he's always just kind of been good. Like, he's not really been excellent. He's really not shown any reason to believe that he can ever take that next leap into being like an upper tier AD carry. Like, maybe I'm wrong about that, but again, we see this so often. There are so many AD carries that are like pronounced as the next big thing in the LPL, and basically none of them ever become that. Almost all of them end up being like, oh, this player had such potential and ended up disappointing, when that potential probably wasn't real and those expectations probably were unfair at the time. So I think that's unfortunately what's happening to 1xN. And then Hoya is the player that, you know, all of the Beishuan hate, all of the Feather hate that we're getting right now, why is that not going to Hoya, who is so clearly the worst player on this team? People talk about Bertle as if he's like the worst player in the universe, as if he's like unwinnable on the top side of the map, and, you know, they compare Hoya to Bertle. Like, they're not even in the same area code. Like, it is not even remotely close. Bertle wins more than he loses in terms of his 1v1s. Hoya gets Poppy into Jax and gets absolutely obliterated. It's not even a conversation. Bertle is disrespected, and Hoya is honestly over-respected at this point. This guy sucks. Like, he needs to be out of this team. There really is no reason for him to still be playing. Thunder Talk was reportedly looking for replacements. You know, You Should Know Me was definitely rumored to be going here, but it doesn't look like that's actually going to happen. So I don't really know what's going on, but you can't win with Hoya. They are going to be one of the worst teams in the league so long as you have him in the top lane. So Thunder Talk has clear advantages, clear weaknesses, but again, the perception around this team I think is very backwards, at least in terms of how I viewed them over the course of this split. And then for Rare Atom, like, they're good. Like, they're fine. They're going to be a team that probably gets to the play-ins. I don't think they're going to be much more than that. I think, again, it's just really hard to break through into the top, like, 7 or 8 right now in the LPL unless one of those teams that is really struggling ends up continuing to struggle, like Weibo Gaming or LNG or one of these teams that is really not, you know, perfect, that has their own problems right now. I think Rare Atom could be a team that could take advantage of that, but at least for now, they look like a team that's probably going to beat up on the bad teams and then struggle a bit once they get to the top. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, and this is the upset we've been waiting for. It's JD Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and of course Weibo won. I mean, is anyone surprised by this? At the end of the day, all Weibo does is show up for games against actual good teams and then completely sit down for games against anyone else. Like, that is who they are. That is who they are going to be for the rest of time, regardless of who is on the roster. It doesn't matter the players, it doesn't matter the coaches, it doesn't matter the circumstance of the rest of the league. It doesn't even really matter the format of the league. If you give Weibo Gaming an opportunity to beat one of the top 3 teams, they're going to do it. And if you give them an opportunity to lose to Invictus Gaming, they're going to do it. Like, it's just how it goes. This team obviously played fantastic in this series. Not only did they beat JD Gaming, but they destroyed them. Like, game 1 was relatively close, game 2 was not. There were some problems on the top side of the map for JDG, which we will get into, but player of the series, for me, is going to go to Tarzan. I think this is really kind of a 50-50 on who you want to give this to, whether it's Breathe, whether it's Tarzan. Both were unbelievably excellent in this series, both absolutely dominated their matchups. I'm giving it to Tarzan. I thought he was better across both games. The brand was still excellent. It was maybe slightly worse than Breathe's Renekton in game number 2, but it was still really good, but the Sejuani was way better in game number 1. He completely ran that first game, and Tarzan, I know people don't like hearing this in the LPL community, because again, if you're a Tarzan defender, then you must be a moron, because clearly look at X, Y, and Z thing that we're throwing out on Reddit. But Tarzan has been the best player for Weibo Gaming by a lot over the course of this split. Xiaohu has really struggled. He's been miserable in the mid lane. Breathe was horrible down the stretch of the placement series. He was one of the worst top laners in the league and only recently has started to find his form again. Crisp was really struggling. Light was consistent, but not exactly winning games for the team. It really was Tarzan kind of putting the team on his back and adapting well to this AP meta and just kind of winning games for Weibo by being the primary facilitator. And that's exactly what he did once again here, whether it was him on the brand actually being able to generate resources for himself or him on the classic Sejuani, you know, his best champion outside of the Zac probably, being able to generate resources for the Corki or the Callista, you know, whoever he really needs to at that point in time. He just makes it look so effortless, and he's going into Kanavi. Like, I get that Tarzan hate is very popular and it's very cool to hate on Tarzan, and you're so edgy and fun for hating on Tarzan from the LNG days, but this guy has been so good over the course of his small time here on Weibo Gaming. He's done everything that he has been asked to do on a team that is collapsing around him. He got them into the top 3 of his own group, and here he is giving them a big win over JDG. But Breathe, thank God he's back. He was really starting to concern me because it felt like he was mentally checked out. That was the big concerning part for me, is it felt like this team was struggling and that they had problems basically everywhere else across the board, and that Breathe, just like he did on RNG, was like, this isn't worth it. Like, I don't think I can invest myself on a game-to-game basis. Like, that's how it felt watching him try to 1v1, but against JD Gaming, that's maybe the spark that he needed to get his head back in the game. I think people are overrating him. I saw some people being like, this puts Breathe in the MVP conversation. What are we doing? Like, did people just, like, not watch the final 2 weeks of the season, of the placements at least? Like, I understand that not everybody watches every game. I'm not going to try to pretend like I'm the normal one that watches every single LPL game, but to say that Breathe has been anything other than, you know, bad for Weibo Gaming over the past couple of weeks is certainly a hot take, I think, and so it's good to see him get back on track. Xiaohu was good, mostly enabled by Tarzan, and also still not dominating the mid lane matchup, but all he has to do is survive. Like, that's really all they're asking him to do and to be, so that's good. Light and Crisp were fine, but it was the top side of the map that dominated, and that's reflective on JD Gaming as well, where their top side just got absolutely shattered. Sheer had one of his worst series so far as a young rookie. I'm pro, like, keeping Sheer in, letting him grow and develop with the rest of this team, but he's gonna have his growing pains, and this was a series where he had his growing pains. He was not particularly good. Breathe kind of destroyed him in the top lane matchup, but more noticeably, Kanavi was horrible here. He's gonna get dead of the series. What happened here? The Zyra, the Karthus, like, both were unplayable, and I don't really know if it's just, like, Kanavi not feeling comfortable on these low mobility, kind of easier to execute champions. I know that feels weird to say, but Kanavi, a player who has, in the past, often really liked champions with a lot of skill expression that want to be more aggressive early. Maybe the Zyra and the Karthus aren't exactly up his alley as much as we would think, but Tarzan just, like, embarrassed him. Like, quite frankly, this was not a close series. This is the worst I've ever seen Kanavi play. Like, this was horrible, horrible, genuinely horrible from Kanavi, and if him and Sheer are going to get destroyed like this in any series, JDG is going to struggle to win, because Kanavi is the best player on this team. Ruler has been better as of late, and trust me, Ruler is a very good player, but Kanavi is the most important and the best player on JD Gaming, and if he's getting absolutely trounced like this, they're not going to win games. And even if Yagao, Ruler, Missing were generally fine, Missing had his problems, especially on the Karma in game number 1. Like, even if they were to survive, if this top side of the map is going to lose like this, it's not going to be all that good for them. But it is just the first series here of Group Ascend. I'm not going to freak out or anything like that. JD Gaming losing to Weibo has become a regular occurrence for them. It's just kind of what you have to expect, and so hopefully they can bounce back from this, and hopefully Weibo can keep this form up. We've said it 100 times. Oh, Weibo, big upset win. Can they keep this momentum? And almost always the answer has been no. They've fallen right back to what they have been. They're probably going to lose to some random team next week like LGD and just completely fall off, and, you know, everybody's going to be talking about their demise, and they'll figure it out once again once they start playing top esports and Billy Gaming, and that kind of, you know, cycle will just continue forever. But at least for now, they looked really good. Tarzan and Breathe in particular looked awesome here. But then moving on now to our third and final day of action here in week number 1 of the actual summer split in the LPL, and we kicked off day number 3 with a matchup between Ultra Prime and Invictus Gaming. That IG, maybe surprisingly, is going to win 2-0. These two teams did play against each other in the group stage. They were in the same group, both in Group D, and both, you know, being the two teams to go down to the Nirvana group. And so definitely interesting to see them matched up at the start. It's not exactly a new matchup, but it was a new outcome with Invictus Gaming actually being able to just kind of dominate this series, be the better team, and certainly have the better execution of these very big wombo comps, if you will. Ultra Prime with a very interesting draft. I think generally speaking, a lot of very interesting drafts here in week number 1. We'll have to see if 14.13 is going to be kind of the weird draft patch. You know, we always get at least one of these over the course of this year, but game number 2, we saw Ken in mid, you know, we saw Nasus on the other side, we saw Lucian mid. Just a lot of really interesting things, I would say, here from both of these teams, but IG definitely with the better execution. Player of the series is going to go to GLFS for me. Honestly, it could go to basically anybody. I think especially, like, On was really good on the Kai'Sa in both of these games. You Should Know Me was really fun to watch on the Renekton. He just adds a whole new level to their top lane situation. Like, he is such an upgrade, you know, over Zuyan, who just wasn't good enough on the top side. Not only is he able to win in the 1v1, but his map awareness towards the back half of the game is just so much better than what they were getting before, so they can create these macro advantages for themselves that they weren't getting. And then, you know, Nenny here with the Ken in mid, that actually really worked in that second game. There were just a lot of things to praise, I would say, for Invictus, and generally this was really fun. This team is really fun, but GLFS was definitely the most consistent member. Going deathless in a series like this on Brand, on Lilia, it's honestly kind of difficult, but he was in the right place at the right time. He was being super active, and he just was really, really good here for IG. So really happy to see that. He's not had the best start, I would say, to his young career. He hasn't been perfect throughout the beginning of this split, but this was probably his best series in the LPL so far. Like I said, On was also very good on the Kai'Sa. He's been the most consistent player on this team. That should be a surprise to absolutely no one. On has been very good for a little while now, and he's just on a bad team. Like we said, You Should Know Me's got great macro and certainly upgrades the floor of what this team can offer and the ceiling because of his mechanical prowess. And then Nenny pulling out the Ken in mid and actually being able to do something on it is really cool. Vampire was fine here. Invictus looked good. This is one of the most fun teams in the LPL. Does that mean I think they're good? No. Like, I still think this is a bit more of like a, oh, you took advantage of an Ultra Prime team that is really collapsing at the current moment. But hey, you know, a win's a win, and they're going to be able to happily take that, I think. But for Ultra Prime on the other side of this, everything is just falling apart for them. They felt like they were locked in for that upper group, for Group Ascend at some point in the group stage, but they were essentially a couple of autos off in that series, and they weren't able to get it done. And all of a sudden now you're sitting here in Group Nirvana losing to Invictus Gaming, and this has basically become worst case scenario for an org that has done everything they could possibly try to do to get relevant in this league. They've just not been able to get there. I think unfortunately some of the players that were overperforming have really kind of returned to earth, most notably Nickit in the support position, who's been kind of bad over the last 2 weeks. He was unbelievable at the start of the split, was really kind of like leading my rookie of the split race. Not so sure where he's going to be standing at the end of the split now, but he's definitely returned to earth. I think Doggo has returned to earth. He was okay, I would say, at the beginning of the split, but he's kind of returned to being, quite frankly, a bad AD carry at this level. Hacker, I think, is still fine. I'm still fine with Hacker. You know, he's not the problem on this team, and Yuikai was generally fine this series, but dud of the series is once again going to go to Qingtian in the top lane. Top lane is just such a disaster in the LPL right now. Like, the bad top laners in the league are like really bad. There are so many teams that just do not have a top side. It's why it's so important for teams to have someone that's passable at that stage, and you know, a lot of teams don't. Like Ultra Prime does not. They've not all year. Qingtian somehow, someway is probably still an upgrade to Decade because he was that bad in the spring split, but it's not like he's been good, so it's just frustrating. What are you pulling Nasus out in game number 2 for? It's just not something that I would ever go for in a situation like this, and generally, I think Ultra Prime is being held back by some of its weak links, but again, a lot of the players that were doing really well have returned back to Earth. Bot lane has really struggled over the past few weeks, and even if Hacker and Uakai are okay, like, they're not going to be players that are dragging you to victories. This team might just fall down towards the bottom of Group Nirvana and really kind of underperform with what they were doing at the beginning of summer by the end of the split. But for Invictus, this is a nice win. Do I think it will translate into anything? Probably not, but it could. Like, they have talent on this team. You should know me and On are experienced and can play at a decent level. Nenny and GLFS looked really good here, and I'm not the biggest fan of Vampire, as anybody knows, but you can win with 4 good players in Group Nirvana. That's definitely the case. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see where IG goes from here. I'm not going to say I have full confidence in them, but I'm not going to completely write them off either. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, and it is certainly an interesting one for me. It's Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on LNG Esports, and of course LNG is going to be able to pick up the win. We see teams that are figuring it out right now, and Ninjas in Pyjamas has looked so weird over the last couple of series. Is this even really a shocking outcome with how this week has gone so far? It's really hard to even say, but LNG looked really good here. They're going to get the 2-0 win. They're going to really kind of dominate both of these games, maybe harder than anybody else in the league so far this week. Like, these were 2 sub, 28-minute games, and neither of them ever really felt like they were going to be close. Ninjas in Pyjamas got absolutely blasted in both of these games in a couple of pretty particular positions, but, it just kind of is the way that they play. They rely so much on 1 or 2 players to be able to step up and play well that, not only when those players don't play well, but when the rest of the team just can't even survive, then all of a sudden, the game plan just completely falls apart. This is a very flawed team that's really only been near the top of the power rankings out of necessity because everybody else has been even more flawed than they are, but I think some of their weaknesses are starting to get exposed, and hopefully this means LNG is starting to get on track. We've been waiting for this team to figure something out, to really just start to get in their own bag at least a little bit, and this is kind of that. Like, this was them really showing us 2023 LNG all over again, just with a little bit of a different coat of paint. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is going to go to Zika for me in the top lane. He was awesome in the top lane. Easily his best series of 2024 so far. He has been majorly disappointing to me. He has really not been good on the top side of the map, and, we'll talk about Shanji in a second. Shanji's actually been pretty good for Ninjas in Pyjamas. He's probably been this team's second best player. It's either him or Aki over the course of this split. He's had more flashy performances, but when Shanji loses hard, he loses hard, and Zika took advantage of that. The Cassante, the Rumble, both games were really freaking good from him on the top side of the map, and he's just going to need to keep that up. Again, like, he just needs to be good. The big draw that he had coming over here from Invictus Gaming was that all he needed to do was be weak side and survive, and that's what he was in year 1. He can still carry games, though. He carried games on IG when he was back on that roster, and he's carrying games now. I just don't think he's going to be great as a primary carrier, as somebody that you want to put a lot of your team hopes on. But in situations like this, yeah, let him take advantage of good matchups. That's a really good idea. The rest of the top side was also very good. Weibo was very solid in this series. He's really started to lock in and I think find a role on this team. Again, his biggest problem was just that it felt like he was disconnected from everybody else, specifically Scout. In terms of their mid-jungle synergy, it felt like he did not understand how this team wanted to play the game. When he first entered their roster, he kind of tried to force his way in and play the same way that he did on Weibo, and this team was just not built for that, and I think he's really settled into playing a much more, calm, controlled style in the early game, and I think that's helped out the team a lot. Scout was fine, didn't make any major mistakes. I actually thought he played relatively well in this series, going into Rookie, who has been fantastic over the course of this split, and then Gala and Hong were also solid. They've been the best part of this team by far over the course of this split so far. They've been majorly consistent, but it's a big win for LNG, just showing that you can beat one of the top teams, that you still are a threat, that you are a team that other teams have to take seriously. It's a major plus for them, and hopefully this is the start of them developing some confidence. Their group was probably a bit tougher than we gave it credit for. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, this team is just flawed. Like, again, like I said, Rookie is really good, and he's going to win a lot of games for you, and Aki and Shanji are going to be in good position sometimes, but when those two players lose, it's actually very tough for NIP to even stand a chance against anybody in the league, let alone a team like LNG with the kind of talent that they have. Dud of the series was kind of up for debate between those two players. I'm going to give it to Shanji. It felt like he got destroyed more on the top side of the map. The Rise in particular in game 2 was just not it. That was not the move, and, Rise was doing like 4 damage per team fight by the end of this game. That champion is in such a bad position right now, even top lane, where I think he is more viable than he is mid lane right now. Those matchups still aren't perfect for him. Even if he is okay in lane against Rumble, he's so useless in the back half of the game because his damage is just so poor. There's so many champions that do what Ryze wants to do right now, but a bit more consistently. So Shanji really struggling there. It's not like he was better on the Mordekaiser in game number 1, but again, he's been better over the course of summer than he was over spring, so I'm not going to freak out too much. And then Aki also really struggling here. I think he is another player that I'm not worried about. He's relatively consistent. This was just a bad performance and a bad matchup for him. Photic and Zhuo are a little bit more concerning because they have kind of come crashing back down to earth after a really good spring split. You know, Photic, as I said, throughout a lot of spring, finally started to play up to that potential that everybody had been claiming he'd already reached. I had always called Photic one of the most overrated players in the world. In fact, he had been like a channel anti-darling, if you will, for a long time, but he was really good in spring and, you know, was starting to get on board with some of the hype with him, but he's just kind of been what he was, you know, the past couple of years. Again, here, maybe he's been a bit more stable because he's not been like the single worst player in the league like he was for parts of last year, but he's not been good. He's not winning 2v2. He's not really doing all that much. It almost feels like the good split at the beginning of this year was more of an outlier. And again, I've always been lower on Photic, but it's just disappointing. And Zhuo is certainly not somebody that I think a lot of people are going to go to bat for after his career trajectory, even if I am a bit higher on Zhuo in terms of his individual performances. So Ninjas in Pyjamas, it's rookie or bust. Like, it really is like he either wins series and games for this team or they get absolutely slaughtered. And it's really difficult to watch. It's really hard to get an idea of how good this team is because Rookie is one of the best players in the world, but when he's not able to 1v9, it's just kind of doomed for them. And especially if Shanji and Aki are losing on the top side, they don't really have enough pressure to be able to generate tempo in games to allow Rookie to actually win them. So very much a difficult situation for Ninjas in Pyjamas, but a really nice win for LNG. Again, hopefully this is the start of something that they can actually translate into bigger wins and more consistent wins. They had a surprisingly tough group. Top Esports, as I've been saying throughout the entirety of the year, is entirely slept on. That was proven over the course of this weekend. And then, of course, you know, our Rare Adam's probably one of the better teams down in the second group. And so LNG maybe was getting a little bit more hate than they deserved. I imagine they will get better. That's why I've kept them pretty high up in my power rankings throughout a majority of this year, and here they kind of proved that I was right to do so. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Split Week Number 1 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen now, the Ascend and the Nirvana standings at the end of Week Number 1. Any ties will, of course, just be broken alphabetically, but honestly, there are quite a few teams that we haven't even seen play in the group stage yet, so really not a lot to go off of. It's one series for basically everybody at absolute maximum, so really not a lot of, you know, interesting information to glean, but there were some changes in my power rankings, which you can see in the power ranking column. That's going to be where I rank these teams from number 1 to number 17, and changes how that has changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers. Top 4 is going to stay the same. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that. JDG did lose, but it was to Weibo Gaming. Like, of course they lost. Like, that was almost an expected loss if they continue to underperform. Maybe I'll move them around, but honestly, I don't really know. I expect those to be the top 3 to 4 teams pretty much locked for the rest of the split unless something drastically changes. But number 5 is going to shift. LNG beating Ninjas in Pyjamas is going to take that spot from them. They are going to leapfrog them. LNG moves up to 5. Ninjas in Pyjamas falls down to 6. NIP just has some flaws right now that I really am concerned about, as I talked about in their segment. And LNG, hopefully this is a team that starts to get it together. I've believed in them basically for the whole year because Gala has played really well, and I do think that the bot lane in general is just going to be a strength basically no matter what. That will give them a floor of basically a top 6-ish team in the LPL, so long as they don't completely screw up the rest of the map, even with players like Weiwei and Scout really underperforming, but they played well this week, so hopefully they can keep that up. But they're going to change. Everything else in the top 10 is going to stay the same. Most of these teams actually didn't play. You had Weibo Gaming with a big win. You know, I considered moving them up, but again, it's not really about one big win. It's about consistency with Weibo. That's keeping them at number 7. You know, number 8 was FPX. They lost, but they lost to a good team. I'm not freaking out about that. And then you've got WE at 9, who I still believe in. They didn't play, so I'm not going to freak out. I still think they're easily the best team in Nirvana, at least, you know, in terms of expectations, and LGD, of course, in the top 10, because they are in Ascend, at least for now. now. But the rest of the bottom is going to change a bit because Ultra Prime is going to fall quite a bit. They're going to fall all the way down to number 15 from number 11. This team is just not playing well right now. If they figure something out, then great, I'll move them back up because they did look like they were going to be a borderline top 10 team for a majority of this split, but they are playing so poor and their players have really returned back to earth. I just don't really see a world in which they compete for an upper tier spot, and right now they do feel like one of the worst teams in the league in terms of the form that they are actively in. They have just not been able to win at all. They're on like a 5-series losing streak or something like that, 5-game losing streak, I should say, or something like that. They're just not looking really good at the moment, and that means everybody that was below them moves up one spot, most notably Rare Atom, moving up to number 11. To me, outside of WE, they are the clear other best team in the lower bracket right now in Group Nirvana, and I would expect those two teams to be kind of the locks to make the play-in stage. Even if they don't have the highest ceilings, they probably have the highest floors. But teams like EDG, teams like Thunder Talk, Invictus Gaming, they're going to be making some interesting runs, I think, so it'll be interesting to watch. But those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. Always love to know what your thoughts and opinions are that are different from mine, but it's time to move into my Player of the Week and my Dud of the Week for week number 1. Player of the Week is actually going to go to Zika, the top laner for LNG. He was awesome in that series against Ninjas in Pyjamas and really pushed his team over the top. There were a couple of really great options this week because, you know, limited sample size. It's hard to really judge off of one series, but I think Zika was the most dominant in his individual series, so he's going to get Player of the Week for me. And then the honorable mentions, Ale, the top laner for AL. He was awesome, especially on the Camille in game number 2, where he really was able to run that series. And Tarzan, the jungler for Weibo, who I thought was super consistent. Even if he didn't necessarily have the same highs as Zika or Ale, I thought he maybe was more consistent across every single play than either of those two were. So those are my 2 honorable mentions, but Player of the Week is going to go to Zika, and then Dud of the Week, shockingly, is going to go to Kanavi, the jungler here for JD Gaming. I mean, he earned it this week. Like, he was horrible on Zyra, on Karthus. Both of them were really bad games. Got completely out-jungled by Tarzan on the other side of that matchup. There really is just no other way to put it. There were other options, but honestly, if we're looking at it genuinely, Kanavi was probably the worst performer in the league this week. I don't expect that to continue. I expect him to get back to his MVP level form, you know, going into next week, and it's Weibo Gaming. They can have any sort of weird shenanigans, but he was awful. Like, he added absolutely no value to his team, and that's a Dud of the Week performance if I've ever heard of one. So Kanavi is Dud of the Week, and Zika is going to get Player of the Week here in week number 1, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LPL on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL, as well as the NACL Tier 2 over in North America every single week here on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all